And good morning and welcome to the Kushner Report for July 2022. As you know, we kind of go dark in August and we'll be back online in September, and we'll have a lot of things going on at that time. So I'd like to thank Robert for being on board today. In spite of him being on his way to Venus on vacation, he was kind enough to stay on board to host our program today. Okay, so today's agenda will be we want to talk about key economic indicators, the global economy, the domestic economy, mergers and acquisitions, other significant economic news, and what's ahead in 2022. And I want to talk about the state of ransomware and key targets that have been identified that are critical to our economy. So what I'd like to start out with is ransomware. Now, we did something on ransomware about a year ago. What I'd like to do is kind of give you an update. So first of all, ransomware is the oldest trick in threat actors' playbook. But in 2021, it proved just how pervasive it has become. Among the attacks that provide an ample supply of targets, big paydays, and fast payments, ransomware was hard to beat. And the frequency and complexity of these attacks increased, if you can imagine this, over 150% in the last year, making the old threat of the biggest facing modem businesses outlandish. So several high-profile incidents occurred in recent years and have also moved ransomware higher up on the Chief Information Security Officer's agenda. And in May of 21, we had an attack that shut down one of the largest pipelines in the United States, while the world's biggest meat processor paid $11 million in ransom to restore its services. So the size of the payouts are becoming incremental. But there's a fear, basically, that it's fast becoming a norm in today's business. And the group behind the pipeline, for example, is estimated to have made over $90 million last year in other attacks. So the size of the attacks continues. If you poll all of these CSOs across the country, 42% that were polled in a recent poll said that they admit that they do not have a ransom policy in place within their organizations, and that's pretty scary. So what is ransomware? Well, it's really a form of malicious software, malware, that's designed to encrypt files on all devices, rendering any files and the systems that rely on them unusable. So malicious actors then demand ransom in exchange for decryption. So ransomware really is traced back to early 1989, when the AIDS virus was used as a lure to extort funds from victims. And i.e., this is what they're doing now with companies and corporations around the world. So how does this really work? Well, typically, the malware displays on a screen, advising the victim that their device is locked or their files are encrypted. And in some cases, after initial infection, ransomware attempts to spread to connected devices and systems within the company itself and to other devices that you may have. So what is the real impact? Well, I'll tell you what, incidents can severely impact the business processes and leave an organization basically without the data they need to operate and deliver mission critical services. For example, articles and hospitals. So one of our folks today was a victim in this. He was scheduled to have surgery. I believe it was with Scripps. Scripps was compromised and they were shut down from 4 to 6 weeks. So he had to wait. Fortunately, he was okay to get the surgery. Other people had to move to other hospitals. So they literally shut the hospital down 4 to 6 weeks. Now, we don't know today whether or not they paid a ransom, or if they did, what the ransom was, how much they had to pay. But the actors are getting smarter, and over time, they're adjusting their tactics to include pressuring victims for payment, threatening to release stolen data across the board. The other thing is, does it really work? Well, paying ransom does not guarantee that you'll regain access to your system or data. And there have been cases where they've heard that the decryption keys were not provided to the people that paid the fees. So that's a problem. And how do you guarantee that from happening? You don't. So what can an organization do? So for example, Gene, who works for major companies, a major engineer, and others on the call that are in security, you have to conduct vulnerability scanning to identify and address vulnerabilities in your company, whether you're a $30 million firm or you're General Motors. And you have to regularly patch and update software operating systems to the latest available versions. And you see Microsoft and Oracle continuing to send updates all the time. Then you have to ensure that devices are configured and that security features are enabled. And of course, best practices are key to make sure that all hardware is configured properly and consistent. The one thing that I saw when I worked in Silicon Valley, I worked with a major biotech company, and what happened is some of the people that were working on the drug specifically, one person lost a computer. And several months later, by the way, that computer was not encrypted. Data showed up somewhere through Yahoo that something similar to that formula was showing up on a Russian website. So my point is that could really kill a company's operating plans, to say the least. So I mentioned to you that a survey just came out and it identified the 10 top targets for ransomware in 2022. This will be very surprising. So bearing in mind that all of these by no means are the only ransomware targets. There's targets in all different vertical markets, etc. So here are the following. So the number one candidate right now, you're not going to believe this, it's called the education system. So the top ransomware targets in recent years. So 88 attacks took place last year across 1,000 schools, colleges, and universities. Secondary we have, which is plentiful here, is retail, along with education. And we saw that taking place in many areas. So the education and retail sectors by no means are the highest attack areas now between January of 2020 and February of 2021. Business, professional, and legal services, many people working in these areas, these companies are basically being targeted in the area which includes accounting firms, advertising, consulting, engineering, marketing, law firms, etc. And in many sectors here, you're talking about very high levels of data. So for example, if you're a law firm and you're doing mergers and acquisitions, they have access to what the terms and conditions are, what the strengths and weaknesses are. That's pretty scary if people get that during closed deals. So those are areas that we have to watch very carefully. Central government. So IT makers from central government organizations found that 40% of them had suffered a ransomware attack in the last 12 months. Then you have the IT areas where it was reported that 65% in ransomware incidents occurred within the IT organizations across the country. And then of course we have manufacturing, which in 2020 published that they had 45 manufacturing companies were attacked and successfully had to pay large fees. So the problem is we had the largest beef manufacturing company in the United States was shut down, and it was confirmed that they paid $11 million over a 2 to 3 week period of time. The energy and utility sector, when I worked in the Bay Area, we spent a lot of time working in cybersecurity with the FBI and the Secret Service around programs. And we used to have a program maybe once a quarter or once a year anyway at Chevron. And the oil companies are continually under attack, trying to shut down the flow of oil. And they're very strong, invest a lot of money, but again, they're under attack continually. And the organizations and utilities, et cetera, you can imagine what happens if they were to shut down the utility places like in Northern California or the East Coast. Healthcare companies are continually be a target where medical centers are high risk. It's widespread security vulnerabilities, and it's a favored target of cyber criminals. Ransomware last year attacked over 1,200 American facilities in 2021, and it's growing. And then, of course, we have local government, where they struck 77 local governments and agencies in the United States, because in some cases, the local governments don't have enough in their war chest in terms of funding to be able to keep at a high level. So they're clearly targets. And then finally, we have financial services. If you look at companies that buy security services, they spend the most money to prevent things with double and triple authentication and everything else. And of course, we had 635 incidents that occurred last year, and 30% of those also occurred in 2020. So those are the areas that we have to watch continually. That kind of gives you a quick update on what's happening with ransomware. Now, what I'd like to do now is I'd like to talk about the key economic indicators. This morning, we're going to cover the gross domestic product. We're going to look at inflation, unemployment at the federal and the California level, and the price per barrel of oil. So first of all, for the full year global GDP as it stands now, no change from our last session, it's still looking about 2.9% this year on a global basis, and then dropping down to 1.7%. You can see the asterisk, that's a change from last year, from last month. And again, in the United States, we're looking at 2% this year and dropping down to 1.7. Now, the first half of the year, we're down a negative 2.5. So we're going to have to see increased stability and growth in the second quarter, that 2% number is not going to happen. We'll have to see what happens. And we're already in July, we're already in the third quarter of 2022. Usually things begin to pick up in September and October, November, and then they kind of slow down a little bit until you really get into December with retail. If we look at the unemployment picture, on a federal level, we're looking at 4.5%, and unemployment next year around 4%. And if you look at California, we're projecting now 4.4%, and then dropping down to 4.1%. Again, a lot of this is tied to what they think is going to happen by raising interest rates in the United States. Now, the one area that we have as a wild card is called the price of barrel of oil of West Texas Intermediate. And it's ranged anywhere. If you go back a couple of years ago when we're really nailed down with the COVID, it was around $12 to $15 a barrel. And then it went up to $135 a barrel not too long ago. And this morning it closed around $96.70. So it's still high, but the price of pumps is coming down. In California, we're seeing it coming down probably more than it is in other parts of the country, but it's starting to come down. And as you know, the oil companies in the United States increased production. I believe it was about 600,000 barrels a day in July. Now let's take a look at the global economy. Their GDP for next year, they said is going to be down about 1.7%, and that's substantial given where they've been over the last several years. What's interesting here is the Chinese economy. There's evidence that the economy is on the road to recovery from its lockdown induced slump. So in some cases, we'll see that their GDP should pick up. If you go back 3 or 4 years ago, they were running somewhere around 10%. They dropped down to somewhere in the 3 to 4 percentile area, and that's based upon the data that they release to the public. In the United Kingdom, the surprise here, they had some gains in May, but there's comments were made recently that they believe that England is already going into a recession, probably a little bit ahead of us. Now, what happened last week in Canada really shocked everybody. It became nuclear because they raised interest rates by 1%. And so they're dealing firmly with a lot of issues around inflation. And then, of course, you know what happened yesterday in the United States. We had a rate hike of 75 basis points, and we'll have to wait and see what the government's going to do in August. Turkey, here's another situation. For those of you that were thinking about moving to Turkey, they had almost 79% increase in inflation, and that's the highest rate in 24 years. And the transportation, if you can believe this, transportation prices are up 124%. And food and non-alcoholic beverages, et cetera, are up 94%. So they've got some serious problems in their economy. Now let's take a look at our economy. So the domestic economy says here, some forecasters are saying that we're going to be in a recession by middle of next year. I kind of disagree with that. I think we're already there. I'll make a comment later that Bank of America about a week ago said that they believe we're entering into a recession now. So it just depends on who you talk to at what point in time it is. And like I said today, we said that the GDP for the second quarter was a negative 9.9%. So we'll see. If you look at the Federal Reserve, I was going to say that the speculation was that we had a negative 1.6 growth. Today it's official. It's 0.9% negative. And again, keep in mind that number will change over the next 2 to 3, 4 months as they continue to go back and look at more detail in terms of that. So there is a lot of concern about, are we going to fall into a recession? And as I said about the Bank of America says, they believe we'll start a mild recession this year. The concern also is about consumer spending as people come out and see what's happening with rates going up, et cetera. Will they continue to buy larger items like appliances, automobiles, et cetera, and continue to travel, which people are starting to travel more now than they have in a long time. Now, as I said earlier, the US dollar is predicted to remain relatively unchanged. It's getting stronger. Each time we raise interest rates and other currencies go down, the dollar is where people want to invest their money. And again, as I said earlier, we're on parity right now with the euro, and we haven't seen that since 2002. So that's pretty good after 20 years. So now let's take a look at inflation. As I mentioned earlier, inflation shot up last month to 9.1%. And if oil prices hadn't dropped to some degree, along with a couple of others, we would have been around 9.6% inflation. So obviously they're going to have to take steps to drive that number down. This is the largest we've seen since 1981, over 40, almost 41 years, this number. The other thing that occurred is the wholesale inflation rose 11.3% in June. That's pretty substantial. Now, the good news is trade exports increased again over April. We saw them rise about another $2 billion, so that's good. That sector is doing well for us. The trade deficit is a big concern. It's still a big issue. It decreased a couple of $1 billion, but we're still running around $88 to $89 billion per month. And we're looking again, last year, we're well over $1 trillion. We could exceed $1 trillion again this year. And that's one factor that's got to be driven down. In the area of retail sales, a surprise last month. We had 1%, if you will, growth. We beat forecasters' expectation, which is very strong. But they weren't adjusted for inflation. Again, we saw different things occurring. As we get into the month of August, which is right around the corner, kids are going back to school in the middle of August, late August, early September. So we'll see what takes place with buying school supplies, clothes, and things of that nature for kids as they go back to school, to see what impact that'll have on retail sales. Let's take a look at the jobs report on the federal level. It was another strong month. We saw an increase of 372,000 jobs. Unemployment remained at 3.6%. But again, if you remember, I said we're looking around 4% by year end. Again, that's taking into account that interest rates are going to rise and corporations may take steps to get in line with that. The real key here is business and professional services for maybe 15 to 17 months has been very positive. We saw another 74,000 jobs added. Construction was good again. There was a decrease in government, but health and education and the leisure and hospitality suites were very strong. But that's been helpful. I mentioned earlier, for those that you were on a few minutes before we started, that the open job openings in the marketplace is around 11.1 million. The question that can't be answered is how many of those jobs are now frozen due to concerns about the economy? Don't know, but that's what we have that's open at this point. Now, taking a look at California, we saw a change, and we only saw 19,900 jobs added in June, down from what we've seen between 40 and 70,000 per month. It was a significant drop. Now, the unemployment rate decreased to 4.2%, down a little bit over the prior month. Look at the first two categories. Administration and construction lost 13,000 jobs, and those are key sectors in the state of California. The other ones were relatively flat. Saw a little bit of healthcare and education. And education is because they're getting ready for school to come back online. And then the other was just insignificant, but we lost a few jobs in real estate. And we may see more of that taking place in the real estate market as we get into more discussion later in my presentation about the housing market. So if we look, for example, at interest rates, as I mentioned earlier, they went up 75 basis points yesterday. Now the mortgage rates are vacillating between 5.8 and 6%. So the latest last Friday was the average 30-year fixed, just in general across the board, was at 6.25%. So that's significantly higher. We have a friend that's moving to Arizona today, and they sold their property and they had a 2.9%. They now have a loan for 6.25. So their interest rate is more than doubled in the last 2 years since they bought their condominium here, sold it, and they're moving to Arizona. Manufacturing, the good news here, we're still very strong. As long as we're over 50 basis points, that's good news. We're running around 55% right now through June, so that's very strong. Now we take a look at factory orders, which is another key indicator. The good news is it was up 1.6% month over month May. So that's good, and it continues to improve on a monthly basis. So that's very important for our economy. Small business optimism, unfortunately, it fell again. It dropped down to 89.5. It's the lowest we've seen since January of 2013. Lots of concern about that. Again, it needs to be over 100 to be significant, and it continues to drop down. Lots of concerns about the economy. Consumer confidence. Well, the index dropped the lowest again since 2021. It fell down again. It's just right now it's around 101, 102 in that area. And so we'll see what happens going forward. But again, it's got to stay above the 100 level to be where their economists are comfortable. I mentioned crude oil prices. What's interesting here is when we had our discussion last month, It was $110.60 per barrel. And this morning it's at $96.70. So we're down almost $14 a barrel. Okay, which is good news. We need to see that continue. The housing market, well, it's getting interesting. So total housing starts across the board dropped 2% in June, and single family starts dropped 8.1%. When we look at the new homes, California home sales plunged 21% last month, and mortgage rates have a major impact on that number. This is the biggest 3-month drop that we've seen since the lockdown in 2020. So let's take a look at Southern California, the housing market. So this is based on the values of inventory that's for sale for last month in June, and this will change as we get into July and August, etc. In Los Angeles, the median home price, the price went up by 8.9% to an aggregate number of $860,000, but sales declined by 3%. And in Orange County, we saw the increase for 13.9%, the mid-range, but sales also declined by 2.9%. And then finally in San Diego, the median rose 1.6% to 825, and sales were down 2.9%. So we'll see what happens as we get through July and August. As you know, the productivity numbers don't come out. They only come out once a quarter. We're still waiting. Maybe we'll have information in September about how we did in the second quarter. Now, usually over the last several months, the good news has been that we've talked about employee displacements. And in the last month, we had a little, but it's starting, now we're starting to see some numbers coming. The only companies I'm going to report on are those that have over 1,000 people being terminated from their jobs. So Novartis, which owns a company called Genentech, they're saying by the beginning of 2024, they'll eliminate 8,000 jobs. Now, there's a company called GoPuff, delivery services company. You may recall they bought Bevmo some time ago. They just laid off 1,500. Then we have Invite, which is in genetic testing, 1,000. And then Ford announced a few days ago, 8,000 jobs will be eliminated. The savings will be used and reallocated to electric vehicles going forward. Now let's take a look at mergers and acquisitions. This is an interesting area because money is still cheap, and it will be cheap for a long time. Even though rates are going up, money is pretty cheap, and a lot of deals are going to continue to take place. We're going to see more consolidations going on between now and the end of the year. So first of all, Sapporo, which is a major Japanese beer manufacturing company, right now is buying Escondido Stone Brewing, which is a major brewing company. And the idea is to have more of joint beer being sold in the United States. So they want to expand the marketplace with using their products along with Stone Brewing, and there's a lot of money behind Sapporo. So the estimate on this is somewhere around $165 million, but again, it's not confirmed yet. If we look at Century-based creative artist agency is acquiring ICM Partners, what this is, it's a consolidation again in the talent industry in Hollywood. So we've seen over the years, a lot of these companies have gone away, they've been consolidated. So the consolidation will result in 3,200 jobs across 25 countries. So now there'll be 3 major players in the industry. If you go back several years ago, there were multitudes of agencies involved in this, but again, it's consolidating. Now, Targa is acquiring Lucid Energy. It's a Delaware-based private equity firm called Riverstone, along with Goldman Sachs Asset Management. And so the deal is worth about $3.5 billion. It's a wholly owned subsidiary in that particular area. Again, one of the things they do, they have one of the largest privately held pipeline systems in different areas. So this is a big deal. It's for them. AstraZeneca has agreed to a $1 billion deal with an oncology player called 1002. Basically, what they're doing is it's an increase in boosting production and expansion and investment, if you will, in therapies for cancer. Then we have GoTo is acquiring Mirador. It's expanding basically mobile device management. So Mirador basically is a device company that's involved in a cloud solution built specifically around SMBs and allowing IT teams to manage end users across various operating systems, such as like ISO, Android, Windows, Microsoft, etc. And then BlackRock is buying renewable natural gas producer for $700 million. This is a Massachusetts-based company. This is interesting. What they do is this. It works with dairy farmers and food companies to convert waste, food waste and cow manure into energy sources. And so Vanguard Renewables will use an anaerobic digesters on farms, such as a large one that produces natural gas in Vermont. And then, of course, Amazon is active again. They just bought a company called One Medical for $3.9 billion as they expand their footprint into that particular area, using in-person, digital, and virtual interactions and services. So that's a big deal for them. So, and there's a lot more mergers that are being discussed right now, but since they're not official, I won't mention them. So let's take a look at what else is happening. So what's significant? Well, for those of you in the real estate market or those thinking about doing things, so last month in June, we saw 60,000 real estate deals fall out. They backed away from the deals for various reasons. That equals 15% of the housing market, and which is an impact. That's the highest we've seen in a long time. What the average is, it's much lower, but a lot of that has to do with people deciding they didn't want to continue on with the process, or they couldn't get their funding. So that's what happened last month. Stay tuned to see what happens in July. Chevron has been in California since Columbus came here. And what we're seeing is the fact that I worked for Chevron when I went to high school and going to college for a while. They decided, as you remember, a month ago, they moved their corporate offices to Houston, Texas, where now all the major oil companies in the United States are headquartered. So in addition to that, they're selling all of the land and offices in the San Ramon office area, and they're just going to keep a small corporate office. So all those jobs will be relocating to Texas between now and the next few months. Not sure how many they are, but it's substantial. So that's a major loss for California in terms of corporate taxes. The U.S. Postal Service, for those of you who still use stamps, is raising the rates again. The stamps are going up. They did as of July 1st, from 58 to 60 cents a stamp. Again, you may recall I told you earlier in the year they had something like $160 billion problem deficit, and they're trying to get that under control. So they're going to do what they can. We also see in the venture capital market, I mentioned this earlier, and I know Ed Steiner's on board with this, there's about $230 billion of dry powder sitting on the sidelines. The activity has cooled off as technology sector faces downturns brought about by raising interest rates and profitability concerns. So firms, meanwhile, are just going to hold on to capital and not spend a lot of money on investments. So that's not good for early stage companies or companies that are looking for additional funding. I mentioned GoProof delivery firm, and basically what they did is eliminating 10% of their global workforce. However, they're going to close 76% of their, 76 warehouses and consolidate operations throughout their organization. The comment here was the business just grew too quickly, and they're trying to hone in everything and get a better handle on running the company. Walmart is active again. You can't drive down the street without seeing a Walmart truck or an Amazon truck. And so what Walmart is going to do is they're going to buy 4,500 electric vans at this point. The vans get probably around 250 miles per charge, and they'll be selling somewhere around $35,000. And the expectations are they've got another order on the back dock for 5,000, and then a couple of years they're going to add 10,000. So you're looking at going all electric with their vehicles going forward. Now, Panasonic is building one of the world's largest electric vehicle battery factories in Kansas City. This is going to be a $4 billion deal, and it's really producing high capacity cells for our friends at Tesla. So this is a good deal. So there's another investment that's going to take place. Then you have Virgin Galactica will open up a spaceship manufacturing facility in Mesa, Arizona. As we talked over the last several months, we're seeing chip manufacturing companies being built in Arizona, Utah, and back in Columbus, Ohio. And then we're seeing more businesses being built in Arizona. And Arizona is going to see a lot of new jobs being created. So their economy is really going to grow substantially. Now, if we look at companies, I mentioned earlier, the following companies on this list officially announced they're freezing hiring. So we have Google, Apple, Spotify, Tesla, NVIDIA, Microsoft, Netflix, Uber, and Lyft, and a host of others. So that it's already beginning right now. What I wanted to mention is, I'm going to do this out of order, but anyway, Toys R Us, which disappeared in 2018, as you recall, is coming back. And what they're going to do in the fall, they have a partnership they've set up with Macy's. So you're going to see Toys R Us products being sold inside of Macy's as we move into the fall for the Christmas holidays. I mentioned earlier too that Ford is going to lay off 8,000 people. Again, they want to ramp up their investments in their electric vehicles. and that's where they're going to spend sources in that area. And when they need to, they'll hire people back. But right now, 8,000 will be leaving. And again, the United States Postal Service, as you know, for those of you, you see your mail being delivered by a lot of these electric vehicles. A lot of these things are on the last leg. So they're going to buy at least 25,000 electric vehicles in the near term. And then the idea is to buy another 50,000 over the next 2 or 3 years to increase their capability and delivery. So with that in mind, that covers everything. I'd like to open it up for Q&A.